What's up, AP Gov? And oh, this is going to be great lighting. Let's try this. I may have to teach the lesson from here so the sun's not in my eyes. With my wife also teaching from home today, this is pretty much the only spot I can record. So after a big unit on civil rights and civil liberties in Unit 3, we're now moving on to Unit 4, which is where we're going to dive into things like political culture, understanding political socialization, taking a look at political ideologies, and all that great stuff. So Unit 4 should be pretty interesting, but this first chapter of Unit 4, Chapter 10, is actually pretty short, so I'm going to try to keep this video relatively short because this chapter in and of itself isn't one of the chapters that pops up a whole lot on the AP exam. So in this video, we're really going to try to answer the top political question of,
why are you the way that you are?
But in a non-rhetorical way. Hit it. So like I said, this chapter is on political culture, but what even is political culture? Well, political culture is defined as the dominant set of beliefs, customs, traditions, and values that define the relationship between citizens and government. And usually the first one and the most defining one of American political culture is individualism, the belief that individuals should be responsible for themselves and for the decisions that they make. I think one of the best ways to teach about American political culture is to compare us with other nations so you can really see where the differences are. Perhaps one of the most telling examples of U.S. individualism and the whole pull yourself up by your own bootstraps mentality is when it comes to our attitude towards welfare. When compared to other nations, the United States does not usually rely on the government to assist those in need quite as much as other countries do. For example, in a survey that polled a bunch of different citizens from a bunch of different countries, it asked what's more important in our society, that everyone be free to pursue their life's goals without interference from the state, or that the state play an active role in society so as to guarantee that nobody is in need. For the United States, 35% said the state ensures that nobody is in need, compared to 58% saying that the state should stay out of it and that people should be free to pursue their goals without state interference. Compare that, though, to the United Kingdom, Poland, Germany, France, Spain, and Lithuania, where it did not quite go that direction. Now, some of you might think the United States has a very generous welfare state, and perhaps they do, but when compared to other countries, the United States actually lags behind them. For example, in this chart, it shows you the welfare benefits in high-income countries. And when compared to countries like Japan, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Canada, you see the United States is not quite on par with them when it comes to how much welfare it gives the average citizen. The United States has a long history of priding itself in individualism and saving and trying to provide for yourself and trying to privately and voluntarily provide for others who can't provide for themselves instead of relying on the state. For example, in my grandfather's history textbook, which was published in 1917, it says this: after touching on how Americans followed Benjamin Franklin's advice to save and have, and as a result of that, from 1880 to 1890, our total prosperity grew big time, it then went on to say that ex-President Eliot of Harvard University says that no person anywhere have equaled our countrymen in what they have done and are doing for the support of schools, churches, and charities. Figures prove the truth of this statement. Not reckoning what was contributed to churches, the private citizens of the United States gave in the course of a single year, 1907 to 1908, nearly $150 million, or practically $500,000 for every working day, to help forward the cause of education, to establish libraries and art museums, to endow homes for friendless children, for the aged poor, and hospitals for the sick and the suffering. The whole amount now given for such purposes averages about $1 billion per a period of 10 years. Keep in mind, this thing was published far before the Great Depression and FDR's New Deal, which established the welfare state that we know today. So while things have changed since this was published, and the United States probably isn't quite as individualistic and as prideful in the fact that we can take care of ourselves without the government, when compared to other countries, the United States is still more individualistic than they are. Individualism is kind of the antithesis of collectivism, the idea that everyone's the same and should conform to being the same. Some traits of individualistic cultures are uniqueness. They pride themselves in being different. Their autonomy, being able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, their independence, and their self-sufficiency, their ability not to have to rely on anyone else. Another staple of American political culture is equality of opportunity. Not equality of result, but equality of opportunity. Let's take a 100-meter dash in a track event, for example. At the beginning of that race, everyone starts at the starting line. Everyone comes out of the blocks at that same line. There's equality of opportunity. Everyone has the same opportunity to win the race because you're starting from the same line. However, the end result of the race is not going to be equal. The fastest person is going to win the race. So there's not an equality of result there. So equality of opportunity is the idea that everyone should have the chance to succeed based on their own effort. And that's not the same as equality of result. Equality of opportunity tries to incentivize working hard, because if everyone gets the same result, why work hard? You know that I'm going to give everyone an A on the next test. Why would you study and work hard at all to absorb the information? Now, you're going to find that people's ideas on politics and economics are not easily separable. They kind of go hand in hand. One of our other major economic political values, besides equality of opportunity, is free enterprise, or laissez-faire, which is French for hands off. And that's an economic system in which government intrudes as little as possible in the economic transactions among citizens and businesses. The government does not set wages or prices or production. Economic questions are left to individuals and businesses in a free enterprise system. Now, over time, the United States has become significantly less laissez-faire than we used to be, say, in like the 18th and 19th centuries. As you're going to see, the concept of equality and freedom often clash. Why? Well, in order to achieve some sort of equality, oftentimes that means the government has to use force to take from those that have more to redistribute that to those who they perceive to be disadvantaged. As Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman brilliantly put it, a society that puts equality in the sense of equality of outcome ahead of freedom will end up with neither equality or freedom. The use of force to achieve equality will destroy freedom. On the other hand, a society that puts freedom first will, as a happy byproduct, end up with both greater freedom and greater equality. Freedom means diversity, but also mobility. It preserves the opportunity for today's less well-off to become tomorrow's rich, and in the process enables almost everyone, from top to bottom, to enjoy a richer and fuller life. So this is kind of where we get into the whole idea of socialism versus capitalism. The idea that with socialism, the individual serves the state and the collective and the greater good. But with capitalism, it's the idea that the state should serve to protect the individual's private property and to protect the individual's freedom so that the individual can pursue their own life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Kind of like what we saw Thomas Jefferson write about in the Declaration of Independence. We'll go into a bit more detail with socialism versus capitalism and some of the economic political ideologies that exist in subsequent chapters. The next major staple of American political culture is rule of law, and that's the principle that no one, including public officials, is above the law. Citizens and officials respect and abide by the law both equally. Under systems of rule of law, there are fair trials, impartial juries, and decisions based off of precedent. There's transparency of government operations, and that, in large part, can lead us to kind of the idea that Hamilton wrote about in Federalist Number 78, where the judicial branch serves as the referee of government to make sure everyone's playing by the rules. Otherwise, what's the point of there being any rules? The final pillar of American political culture is the idea of limited government, and that's the concept that human beings have inherent rights that they're born with, natural rights, that the government cannot take away. There's checks and balances that are written into the Constitution. There's a division of power between the federal government and the states called federalism, and there's a Bill of Rights that limits the government's power from abusing certain rights. I mean, these are all things you heard about in Federalist Number 51 that James Madison wrote about, the idea of checks and balances, separation of powers, and federalism. And then you also have the ideas that Thomas Jefferson wrote about in the Declaration of Independence when it comes to natural rights. So you can see the residue of all of these concepts in our American political culture today. So section 2 of chapter 10 jumps into political socialization, and that's defined as the experiences and factors that shape an individual's political values, attitudes, and behaviors. Now, the phrase we use to describe an individual's political values, attitudes, and behaviors is political ideology. That's an individual's coherent set of beliefs about government and politics. So to summarize that, political ideology is what you believe. Political socialization is how did you get to believe that? What factors influence you to believe something? The number one most important factor to the process of political socialization is the family. Your party identification, which political party you are, is strongly linked with your family's political beliefs. So if your family is Republican, there's a good chance that you're going to be Republican. If your family's Democrats, then there's a good chance you'll be a Democrat. Why? Because that's the source of where you get a lot of your political information from. That's probably your top source of exposure. The second most important political factor is education, and that helps transmit norms. We teach American civics. Obviously, you take a government class in high school. Part of my job as your teacher is to introduce students to political participation and volunteering. That gives me a lot of power to influence your all's political beliefs into the future. Should I use my power to try to mold you all in my own political image?
Do it. Don't try it.
Yeah, Obi-Wan's right. Guess I'll reject the dark side this time. But I mean, ultimately in your life, you spend the most time with your family and then at school. So it makes sense that those two things would be the primary factors in helping shape and mold your political opinions. Religion is another significant indicator of one's political ideology and culture. So Catholics and Jews are more liberal than Protestants. White Catholics tended to vote for Trump, whereas Hispanic Catholics tended to vote for Clinton in the 2016 election, and that was pretty much the same thing in 2020 with Biden. Evangelicals are among the most conservative in all of American political culture, and Muslims strongly favor Democrats. Now, churches are influential because of their doctrinal positions, their sermons, or social interaction among members. A lot of people tend to think that all religious people vote for conservatives and Republicans, but as I just showed you, that's not necessarily true. And some people like to think that all immigrants tend to vote Democrat, but that's not necessarily true either. Sometimes immigrants that are of a certain faith might be influenced on how they're going to vote based off of their faith more so than their status as an immigrant. Now, another significant impact of your political beliefs is going to be the generation you grew up in and what stage in life you're in. Political views tend to change over the course of time depending on what stage of life you might be experiencing and maybe what even's happened to your generation. There's a generational effect, and that's where the impact of a historical event experienced by a generation can shape their political views. The generation that experienced World War I became much more isolationist and non-interventionist in their foreign policy. The generation that experienced the Great Depression was much more open to the government helping them through welfare. There's also the life cycle effect, and that's the impact of a person's age and stage in life on his or her political views. For example, teenagers tend to support much higher taxes until they get older and are forced to pay more in taxes, and then that idea kind of changes. Millennials are shaped by terrorism, like baby boomers are shaped by Vietnam and the Watergate scandal. So while obviously your parents and school can impact what you think politically, things like the generational effect and the life cycle effect also have an impact on your political thinking as well. As you can see in this chart here, after Vietnam and Watergate, people's trust in government significantly fell after that, and it hasn't really recovered that much. Now, throughout history, it's been pretty typical for the younger generations to be more liberal and to be more socially tolerant of things that maybe the previous generation was more conservative about and maybe not so tolerant of. Like, for example, same-sex marriage. In this chart you can see here, this shows you that the younger the generation, the more likely they are to accept and favor same-sex marriage. Now, this generally speaking means that the younger generations tend to vote for Democrats and the older generation tend to vote for Republicans. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and I'm sure many of you can point out exceptions. Some of you probably are exceptions to that, but generally speaking, that's the trend that we see. Now, as liberal as Gen Z and millennials are, they don't often actually get out and vote or participate politically all that much, which is why Democrats often are the ones behind these get out and vote campaigns, because they're targeting the youth that are kind of apathetic towards politics and don't really get out and vote very much, because they know that if they can get them out to vote, they're likely going to vote for Democrats. So that's why any of you that plan on going to college, I can almost guarantee you're going to see some liberal advocacy groups, some Democratic, maybe even political action committees try to get out there and get young people out to vote, because they know that that's going to help the Democratic Party more likely than not. I remember my freshman year up at Bowling Green State University. It was an election year that year, and the local Democratic Party would literally have golf carts on campus around election time trying to take people out to go register to vote and trying to drive them to the polls on election day. Whereas the Republican Party pretty much had zero presence on campus because they knew that most people there were not going to be voting for them. If Republicans were driving people to the polls on campus, they were probably driving people to the polls that were going to vote against their party. So you can see why they had absolutely no incentive to do that. Now, the last thing Chapter 10 discusses, and this is more of a recent phenomenon, has been globalization's impact on American political culture. Globalization is the increasing interconnectedness of people, businesses, and countries throughout the world, and technology has been a big part in kind of breaking down these barriers. It blurs the lines between international and domestic politics. America is not the only superpower in the world. China is a global economic power that has built up their military strength, especially recently, and Russia, as you've seen in the news, aggressively tries to assert their own interest in Europe and in the United States. That through troll farms on social media sites to try to spread fake news. In recent years, cyber warfare has really taken the main stage as the type of warfare maybe we're starting to move into in the 21st century. And China, Russia, the United States, Iran, North Korea, all compete against each other by using technology to try to gain influence and further their own political agendas. Now, other countries aren't the only things that have impacted our political culture in the United States. There's other actors on the world stage, such as multinational corporations. And these are companies that make, transport, and market goods and services in 2 or more countries. There's also non-governmental organizations, NGOs. These are independent groups outside of the government that work towards a public cause. And there's also intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs, and they challenge the sovereignty of countries, the European Union, the World Trade Organization. Sometimes countries will get together and agree to give up some of their own sovereignty to an intergovernmental organization to try to achieve some sort of goal that maybe otherwise they couldn't have achieved on their own. So an example of an IGO would be, like I said, the European Union, and an example of an NGO would be an organization like Doctors Without Borders. Now, there are some benefits to globalization, such as globalization can encourage democratization. That's where states may reach certain levels of democracy to be accepted into international organizations. There are watchdog NGOs that hold authoritarian regimes accountable to an international audience, and the citizens in these countries have access to technology to better question their government and organize. Globalization has also had some economic impacts as well, like on free trade. Remember, free trade is where there are few restrictions imposed on the flow of goods and services across national borders. You might remember hearing about NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. That was a free trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. President Trump was not a big fan of this. Barack Obama endorsed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and that was a regional trade agreement struck between 12 nations, but President Trump was not a big fan of that. President Trump, of course, loved his tariffs. Now, President Trump was not a big fan of globalization because of something called outsourcing, and that occurs when a company moves its business to a place where labor costs are cheaper or production is more efficient because workers work longer hours for less money. This results in loss of jobs domestically in the United States, where we have higher wages, in part due to minimum wage laws, and it may lower environmental and labor standards in foreign countries, as they may say, hey, you know what, you can come here and we're not going to tax you for pollution. Trump also wasn't a big fan of globalization because he thought that it broke down and weakened traditional cultures, and that this new interconnectivity, especially with new technologies, could connect people and groups with negative and dangerous intentions. And that'll do it for Chapter 10. It's a relatively short chapter. As for your assignments this week, you've obviously got this Ed puzzle, and then we're going to get back into doing practice FRQs. So you have our practice FRQ, which is due on Thursday. Make sure you listen to my feedback when I return that to you. And then I want you to outline all of Chapter 10, all 3 sections worth of it. That'll be due on Friday. Now that we're gearing back up doing FRQs, I am going to tell you I'm going to start grading them harder. My expectations are going to be a bit higher as we move closer to the AP exam. So make sure you put a lot of good effort into them. Make sure you review over the feedback I gave you over the ones you did in the fall. And you can even look up some tips on YouTube and different websites into how to write a good practice FRQ. So I'm just giving you a heads up. They might look a little bit different. Make sure you take a good look at the rubric and take a good look at the feedback when I give it to you. And oh yeah, I totally forgot to mention, when this video is going to be playing for you all, it's going to be President's Day week, so make sure you look up some random facts about the presidents. Hey, if you're really bored, maybe you can email me your top 5 presidents of all time and your 5 worst presidents of all time, just for funsies. As always, reach out if you need anything, and have a great week.